Hello ladies and gentlemen, Richard here, the creator of the Top Hat Gaming Man. And during the midweek recently, we have been exploring in depth the story of how Nintendo apparently saved the North American gaming market. In fact, we have been perhaps thinking about all of this a little too deeply, but personally that's something I like to do on YouTube, and that is applying deeper thinking to these somewhat trivial subjects, come to think of it. My whole argument is Nintendo have always been a huge contributor to the gaming market, but I do not believe they have ever saved an industry, because despite the fact there was a lull and a video game crash in the North American market back in 1983, gaming would have still survived. As past 1983, people still continued to game, so something would have blossomed and flourished, especially when you consider that gaming was surviving fine around the rest of the world. So I think it just comes down to looking at Nintendo through the lens of a fanboy. The only people who really say Nintendo saved the whole industry are fanboys. So if you apply the same sort of fanboy lens to a number of other situations, you can also make the same outrageous claim that they saved the video game industry as well. Like, I've uploaded a video recently about how Sega saved the video game industry, as without Sega you would have just had Nintendo, and without any competition Nintendo would have just kept pumping out the same style product until people would have got bored of them, just like how people got bored of the Atari 2600 a few years prior to that. It wouldn't surprise me at all is if Sega Mega Drive / Genesis, as it's known out in North America, was not released. It wouldn't surprise me if Nintendo just stuck with the Nintendo Entertainment System for another 4 or 5 years until everyone was bored of gaming and and then someone else had to come in and rejuvenate the whole market. But Sega came along, they brought competition along, and then the market continued to flourish. Anyway, today I'm going to be looking at it through the lens of Atari, and how Atari saved the whole video game industry too, when you look at it from the stupid eyes of a fanboy once again. But no one saved video game industries, which kind of makes this video mute. But they saved it in a way, I suppose, when you look at it from a certain angle, as I said. Basically, what I'm claiming here is Atari did pretty much all the things what Nintendo are famous for doing just about 8 years prior to them. The Nintendo Entertainment System was released in North America in 1985. I believe, apparently, it rejuvenated the market after a period in which, as I said, games weren't selling too well at the time, or games consoles themselves. When the Atari VCS was originally released in 1977, the market was very similar. People overall had become very bored of video games, purely due to the reason that they were becoming a little bit dated and stagnant, just like what would happen to the Atari itself 6 years later. This of course was the Pong console era, where people would buy one standalone unit just to play one game, of course being Pong. And there was a whole variety of these ridiculous systems. There were so many, in fact, consumers literally didn't know where to look, because there were so many of these systems which effectively did near enough the same thing, just slightly different. So with this Pong, most people back then just made the assumption that it was some sort of craze, like you can play tennis on a television. Most people just looked at it as tennis, so you'd play this tennis game on the TV and it was a good novel fun for its time. But after a while, obviously, like all fads, they wear off. Like, do you remember Pogs back in the 90s, like 1997. I would assume back then that many people just thought video games would have ended up like Pogs. We played Pong for a little bit and then we'd just move on with our lives, a bit like how a lot of people moved on from the Wii into never gaming ever again. So in a way, I suppose the Wii is like Pong, but now we're going a little bit off track. So as I said, Atari saved the video game industry in exactly the same way Nintendo did, by rejuvenating the North American market after it stagnated due to a poor selection of games. The other way you could make a huge argument for Atari saving the industry is they popularised the ROM cartridge. So, not for the first time ever, but there was a popular system available where you had multiple cartridges where you could play a variety of different games simply by changing the cartridge, which was amazing back in its time. What some of you may or may not know though, that was not actually the first system to be able to do that. The first system in fact was a platform known as the Fairchild Channel F, which used the exact same technology as the Atari VCS only 1 year prior. So with that in mind, you could also make a same ridiculous case for the Fairchild Channel F saving the video game industry. So has the Fairchild Channel F done more for gaming than Nintendo themselves? You really could make a strong case for that, because Nintendo never invented ROM cartridges. What really has Nintendo ever brought to the table which is new and innovative? Like I said, Atari didn't even really, they just took an existing trope and developed it and marketed it much better. Nintendo often did the same thing. So that's 2 points so far on how Atari saved the industry. Firstly, through rejuvenating a somewhat suffering market. Secondly, for popularising the ROM cartridge. So the third reason I'm going to bring here is making gaming more mainstream than it had ever been before. People often credit characters like Mario and Link from The Legend of Zelda to bring gaming mainstream. But personally, I think that's absolutely balderdash. Gaming was mainstream years and years and years before that. The arcades brought gaming mainstream. Like, who can honestly say back then that they did not play games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders? Those two games were ridiculous household names. Anyone I speak to in their 50s or their 60s can reminisce about their fun memories they have of playing both of those platforms in their local pubs. That is well known and documented that Pac-Man and Space Invaders were as mainstream as gaming would get. Literally everyone had heard of those. Sure, Mario and Zelda would come along later, but could we really even argue a case for Zelda ever becoming more mainstream than Pac-Man or Space Invaders? Because personally, I don't think it is as well known as Pac-Man or Space Invaders, is it? Like, I don't even know how we can prove this or not, but I just personally think if you was to go out there and do a survey, interviewing members of the general public, showing a picture of Link and showing a picture of Pac-Man, I reckon that more people would be able to identify Pac-Man, especially if we were talking about a large age demographic ranging from 70 years old right down to about 10 years old. More people would be able to identify Pac-Man. And Atari, with their VCS, were the first company to bring those titles home into the living room. They were the first company to ever bring the mainstream into our rooms, as I said, and let you play games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders. Sure, for example, Pac-Man wasn't the greatest of arcade conversions, but Space Invaders certainly was a very well done one. And who cares that Pac-Man wasn't that great, because later on they would release Pac-Man Jr. and Miss Pac-Man, which were much better quality gameplay experiences anyway. So we talk about Nintendo for bringing gaming mainstream, but so did Atari. And did gaming actually ever become any more mainstream when Nintendo came along? Well, I'd say gaming certainly didn't become more mainstream as a result in Europe, but Pac-Man, Space Invaders, all over the globe, they will be remembered as two of the most influential titles of all time. And we can thank Atari for being a huge contributing factor towards that. So now we've got 3 huge points regarding how they saved the gaming industry. We have got how they rejuvenated a low North American market, they popularised the ROM cartridge, and they brought gaming more mainstream than ever before by bringing in platforms, like I said, such as Pac-Man and Space Invaders. And that's before we even talk about all the movie licensed titles they had on their platform. And then later on than that, even all the amazing third-party support in which the Atari would receive, even though it may have been against their will at the bloody time. So to conclude this video, I have mentioned about looking at this whole thing through lenses of different kinds of fanboys. However, fanboy lenses aside, when I really think about it, I do genuinely believe that Atari are perhaps more responsible for most of which we have in the gaming industry today than that of Nintendo. when you actually sit down and logically think about it. They've contributed far more important things to gaming history. Like I said, they introduced the ROM cartridge of all things, like the actual cartridges themselves. They popularised those. Without Atari, who knows whether those would have actually ever caught on. And like I said, more importantly than that, the foundations would not have been laid in the first place for Nintendo to have been able to set up shop in the West at all. People only knew about video games due to the success companies like Atari had had in the first place. Of course, along with the arcade market, of course. But overall, I certainly believe that if we can accredit any company for saving an entire industry, I would place that on the shoulders of Atari. Because who genuinely knows if we would have such a big video game industry today if it wasn't for them? We could have been stuck with Pong forever. Imagine that. Cheerio!